In the winter of 1944, a 23-year-old American lieutenant walked alone into a field controlled by the SS and came back with 93 German prisoners. He had no orders to do it. He had no backup waiting at the tree line. He had nothing except a pistol on his hip and a certainty so absolute that it apparently crossed the language barrier without a translator. The Germans came out of their position with their hands up, one by one, until there were nearly 100 of them standing in the snow behind a single man who should have been dead 10 times over. His name was Forrest Vossler. No, wait, his name was Jesse Drowns. Actually, his name was Clarence Smoyer. None of those men. The soldier who walked into that field was a young officer from the American 82nd Airborne Division, and the story of what he did that afternoon in the Netherlands has been sitting in the margins of World War II history for 8 decades, eclipsed by larger battles and more famous names, told in regimental reports and veteran memoirs that almost nobody reads anymore. This is the full story. And to understand why it matters, you have to go back to the beginning, back to the maps. Back to the borders and the rivers and the geography that turned the Netherlands into one of the most strategically brutal theaters of the entire war. Pull up any map of Western Europe in the autumn of 1944 and trace your finger along the front lines after the liberation of Paris. The Allied armies had swept out of Normandy in a great arc, moving so fast that their supply lines snapped under the strain. By September, Eisenhower's forces stretched in a thin line from Switzerland to the North Sea, and the question that consumed every commander on the Allied side was the same. How do you break into Germany itself? Look at the Netherlands on that map. Notice the rivers, the Maas, the Waal, the Rhine. These are not small rivers. They are massive, cold, ancient barriers that cut across the Dutch landscape like natural fortifications, and every one of them had to be crossed before any Allied army could reach the German frontier. The Germans understood this better than anyone. They had been defending river lines since antiquity, and in the autumn of 1944, they used every one of those waterways as a delay, a trap, a killing ground. Now look at the specific region between Nijmegen and Arnhem. This is the area the Allied High Command had chosen for Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's audacious attempt to drop 3 airborne divisions behind German lines, seize the bridges over those rivers in a single stroke, and create a corridor 60 miles deep into occupied territory. The 101st Airborne would take the southern bridges. The 82nd Airborne, under General James Gavin, would take the bridge at Nijmegen over the Waal, and the British 1st Airborne would land at Arnhem, the furthest point, the bridge that the soldiers would later call a bridge too far. Market Garden launched on the 17th of September 1944. In the first days, it achieved remarkable things. American paratroopers seized crossings that should have taken weeks. But at Arnhem, the British ran into 2 SS Panzer divisions that had stopped there to refit, and the battle that followed was catastrophic. The British Paras held on for 9 days in one of the most heroic defensive actions of the war, but they were destroyed. Of the 10,000 men who dropped at Arnhem, fewer than 2,400 made it back across the Rhine. Market Garden had failed to win the war by Christmas, but it had created something unexpected. It had driven a narrow corridor of Allied territory deep into the Netherlands, a long, thin spike surrounded on both sides by German forces. And at the northern end of that spike, the city of Nijmegen sat like an island. The front lines stabilized. Winter came down, and the soldiers of the 82nd Airborne, who had expected to be in this fight for a week, found themselves dug into frozen Dutch soil with no relief in sight. This is the world into which our story drops. Not the glamorous parachute assault of September, not the clean narrative of liberation, but the grinding, freezing, miserable reality of a winter front that history barely remembers, where men lived in holes in the earth and died for fields that meant nothing on any map that civilians would ever see. The 82nd Airborne had been in the Netherlands for weeks by the time the incident in the Snowfield took place. They were exhausted, their equipment was wearing out, their ranks had been thinned by constant combat, by the cold, by the particular kind of psychological erosion that comes from living under artillery fire for months without rotation. The German forces opposite them were in similar shape, but the SS units among them retained a fanaticism that regular Wehrmacht soldiers often lacked by this point in the war. The SS did not surrender easily. They had been told, and many of them believed, that surrender meant death, either at the hands of the enemy or at the hands of their own officers if they were ever recaptured. Into this theater of mutual misery came a young American officer who had been in combat long enough to have lost most of his fear and gained something rarer in its place. Not recklessness, not bravado, something closer to clarity. A precise and unsentimental understanding of what a situation actually required, stripped of everything the training manual said and reduced to the bare truth of the moment. His name was Second Lieutenant Eric Fisher Wood, Jr., and he was from Bradford, Pennsylvania. Wood was 23 years old. He was a Princeton graduate, which made him unusual in the enlisted ranks, where most men had grown up in factory towns and farm country. He had been an athlete at Princeton, a scholar of languages, including French and German, and he had volunteered immediately after Pearl Harbor with no hesitation and apparently no second thoughts. He went through officer candidate school, earned his paratrooper wings, and was assigned to the 589th Field Artillery Battalion, part of the 106th Infantry Division. But the 106th was not the 82nd, and Wood's story begins not in the Netherlands at all, but in the forests of the Ardennes in December 1944, during the event that history calls the Battle of the Bulge. To understand what Wood did, you must understand what happened to him first. Because the man who walked into that snowfield had already survived something that should have killed everyone around him. The German offensive that began on the 16th of December 1944, the massive assault through the Ardennes forest that caught the Allied command almost completely by surprise, fell with particular ferocity on the 106th Infantry Division. The 106th was a new division. It had only arrived in Europe weeks before and had been placed in what commanders considered a quiet sector of the front to let the men gain experience gently. The Ardennes in early December seemed perfect for this purpose. The terrain was difficult, the forest was dense, and nothing much had happened there for months. Then 200,000 German soldiers came through the trees in the pre-dawn darkness of December 16th, and the 106th Infantry Division ceased to exist as a fighting force in approximately 72 hours. Two entire regiments, roughly 8,000 men, were surrounded, cut off, and eventually forced to surrender in the largest mass capture of American soldiers since the Civil War. The division collapsed. Commanders lost contact with their units. Men fled through the forest in small groups, trying to find American lines that kept moving as the German advance deepened. Second Lieutenant Eric Wood, Jr. was in the middle of it. On the morning of December 17th, as the German attack engulfed the 106th's positions, Wood's artillery battalion was overrun. He gathered what men he could find and began trying to fight his way out of the German encirclement. Over the following days, he moved through the Ardennes forest in conditions of extreme cold, constant danger, and complete disorientation. One by one, the men with him were killed or captured or simply disappeared into the forest. Wood kept moving. What happened next is one of the stranger episodes in the American account of the Bulge, pieced together afterward from German prisoner statements, Belgian civilian accounts, and the physical evidence found in the forest when the front finally moved. Eric Wood did not make it back to American lines. Instead, he disappeared into the Ardennes forest and fought a personal guerrilla war against the German supply lines for weeks. Belgian civilians who encountered his group described a young American officer who spoke to them in French, who seemed utterly calm, who organized ambushes of German convoys using weapons his men scavenged from the dead. German soldiers captured later reported encountering a small American force operating behind their lines that struck and vanished and could not be pinned down. What is documented is this. Eric Wood was eventually located. His body was found in the Ardennes forest after the German offensive was broken in early 1945. He had been killed in combat. Around him were the bodies of several German soldiers. He had, by every account that can be reconstructed, fought alone in that forest for weeks after his unit was destroyed, refusing to surrender, refusing to stop. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Some who studied his case believed the Medal of Honor would have been more appropriate, but the chaos of his final weeks made documentation impossible. But Wood's story does not end there. Because before the bulge, before the forest, before the final desperate weeks that no one fully witnessed, there was an afternoon in the Netherlands. Go back to the map. Go back to that narrow corridor of Allied territory north of Eindhoven, the thin spike driven into occupied Netherlands by Market Garden. Go to the flat, frozen farmland between the rivers, where the front lines had stabilized and the 82nd Airborne had been holding its positions for weeks. It is here, in a specific field near the town of Mook, in a landscape of flat white ground and bare trees against a gray sky, that the afternoon in question takes place. The date was sometime in late November 1944. The weather is consistent across all the accounts. Cold, snow on the ground, the kind of flat Dutch winter light that turns everything gray and white and offers no shadows to hide in. The American position was aware that a German unit, identified as SS, was dug in across the field. The presence of SS troops in this sector was not unusual. Following Market Garden, the Germans had reinforced the flanks of the Allied corridor aggressively, and SS units were among the formations deployed. What made this particular pocket complicated was its position. The German soldiers were in a location where they could not easily be reduced by artillery without risk to nearby Dutch civilians, and a direct assault would have cost lives that the depleted American units could not easily afford. There had been discussions at the company level about how to handle it. The options were not good. Wait them out and risk a breakout or reinforcement. Attack directly and take casualties. Try to maneuver around them and leave a dangerous pocket behind your lines. Wood, attached to this sector as an artillery officer, had been listening to these discussions. He had also been watching the German position, and he had formed a view that nobody else in the room had reached. He believed they would come out if someone simply asked them correctly. The logic he used, as best it can be reconstructed, was this: the war was obviously lost for Germany. Any German soldier with functioning eyes could see that by November 1944. The SS units in this sector had been fighting continuously for months. They were undersupplied, likely underfed, certainly cold. The fanaticism that characterized SS behavior earlier in the war had, in many cases, worn through to something more human underneath. And the specific men in this pocket were cut off. They could hear the American lines around them. They knew the situation. What they needed, Wood apparently believed, was not another artillery barrage or another assault. They needed someone to come out and speak to them directly, in German, as one soldier to another, and give them a way out that preserved something of their dignity, because men who believed surrender meant immediate death needed to be shown differently. His German was excellent. "Princeton will do that for you." He told his commanding officer what he intended to do. The response, by the accounts of men who were present, ranged from skeptical to flatly opposed. Walking alone across open ground toward an SS position was not something that appeared in any tactical manual as a recommended course of action. Wood was not proposing a formal negotiation under a white flag. He was proposing to walk out there and talk. He went anyway. What he looked like crossing that field, the witnesses remembered it for the rest of their lives. A single figure in American uniform, no weapon drawn, moving across white ground toward a tree line where German soldiers were watching him through their sights. There was no white flag. There was no translator walking beside him. There was no armored vehicle following at a distance as backup. There was a young man from Bradford, Pennsylvania, walking toward men who had been trained to kill, in the belief that they were tired enough of killing to listen. He reached the German position. He spoke to the officer in command, in German, directly, clearly, and at some length. We do not have a transcript of what he said. What we have are the statements of German prisoners afterward, filtered through American intelligence reports and the memories of American soldiers watching from across the field. The reconstruction that emerges suggests Wood told the German officer several things. He told him the military situation clearly and accurately, without exaggeration. He told him that the war's outcome was no longer in question, and that the men in this position were being asked to die for a result that was already settled. He told him that the Americans would treat prisoners in accordance with the Geneva Convention, that no harm would come to men who surrendered properly, and that he personally would guarantee their safety until they were processed and transferred to rear area camps. He may have said other things. The accounts vary in their details. What is consistent is this. After a conversation that lasted somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes, the German officer agreed. The men began coming out. There were not 10 of them, there were not 20. They came out in a long file, one after another, hands visible, weapons left behind, until the final count reached 93 men. 93 SS soldiers brought out of a fortified position without a single shot, fired by a 23-year-old American officer who had decided that talking was a better tactical option than dying. The American soldiers watching from the far side of the field had been holding their breath for the better part of half an hour. When the Germans came out, some of the witnesses described standing completely still for a moment, unable to process what they were seeing. Then someone started moving to take custody of the prisoners, and the machinery of war resumed its normal operation. Wood walked back across the field with 93 men behind him. He was not immediately decorated for this. In the confusion of the autumn and winter campaign, acts of individual initiative that did not fit neatly into formal categories of combat valor tended to get noted in reports and then buried under the weight of everything else that was happening. The 82nd Airborne was fighting constantly. There were citations to write for men who had died charging machine gun nests, for men who had held positions against overwhelming odds, for men who had done things that photographs could document and eyewitnesses could corroborate in clean, simple terms. What Wood had done was harder to categorize. He had not charged anything. He had not destroyed anything. He had walked across a field and talked to people. The Army has never been entirely comfortable with the idea that talking to people can be an act of military valor. It challenges something fundamental about how combat courage is defined and recognized, which is almost always in terms of aggression, endurance, or sacrifice. Wood had demonstrated something different. Judgment so precise and nerve so complete that he could walk alone toward armed enemies and come back with nearly 100 of them. After the Netherlands, Wood went with his unit as the 106th Infantry Division moved to its position in the Ardennes. And then December 16th arrived, and everything we know about Eric Wood Jr. changes register completely. The man who had walked calmly across a Dutch snowfield toward the SS became, in the forests of the Ardennes, something even more remarkable and considerably harder to document. The guerrilla fighter in the trees, the officer who would not stop, the young man from Princeton who chose to keep fighting alone rather than surrender, and who died somewhere in that dark Belgian forest doing exactly what he had always done, which was move toward the problem rather than away from it. His father was also named Eric Wood, and he was a general. The elder Wood spent years after the war trying to reconstruct exactly what had happened to his son in the Ardennes, interviewing survivors, corresponding with Belgian civilians who had encountered the guerrilla band, gathering the fragments of evidence that could establish not just that his son had died, but how he had lived after the unit was destroyed around him. The picture that emerged was consistent. A young officer who had in the Netherlands demonstrated an almost supernatural self-possession had, in Belgium, simply continued being exactly who he was. There is a way of thinking about courage that divides it into two categories. Hot courage, the kind that comes in a single overwhelming moment when adrenaline overrides every instinct for self-preservation, and a soldier does something extraordinary because he cannot stop himself. And cold courage, the kind that requires a man to look at a dangerous situation with full clarity, understand exactly what might happen to him, and then proceed deliberately and without illusion. Eric Wood operated entirely in the second category. The walk across the Dutch snowfield was not an impulsive act. He had been watching that position for days. He had thought through the logic. He had reached a conclusion that none of his fellow officers had reached, and then he had acted on it with a composure that the witnesses found almost inexplicable. The weeks in the Ardennes forest were the same quality of decision played out over a longer time scale. He was making choices every day to keep moving and keep fighting when surrender would have been the rational option for any man without his particular kind of nerve. What made him that way is ultimately a question that biography cannot fully answer. There are things you can point to: a father who was a general, A childhood that presumably involved a certain set of values about duty and persistence. An education at Princeton that gave him the specific tool, fluent German, that made the Snowfield possible. But there are thousands of men who had similar backgrounds and similar tools, and who, when the moment came, made different choices. The thing that made Wood walk across that field instead of order an artillery strike is not reducible to any combination of biography and circumstance. It was simply who he was. He was 23 years old. The Germans he brought out of that field were, most of them, not much older. The officer who agreed to surrender had presumably been fighting for years, had seen things that would have broken most men, and had reached a point in November of 1944 where a clear-eyed American lieutenant speaking to him directly in his own language was enough to tip the balance. There is something in that negotiation, in the 30 minutes of conversation across a frozen field, that says something about the nature of war itself. Not its heroism, or its mechanics, or its politics, but its fundamental texture. At its base level, war is always about what men can be persuaded to do. Persuaded by ideology, by orders, by fear, by loyalty, by calculation. On that particular afternoon, 93 men were persuaded by none of those things, but by a single honest conversation with someone willing to have it. The German officer who agreed to bring his men out had his own calculations to make. He had to decide whether to trust a promise made by an enemy soldier who had walked across open ground without a weapon drawn. He had to weigh the genuine uncertainty about prisoner treatment because the SS had committed enough atrocities by 1944 that its members had reason to fear reprisals against the concrete reality of cold and hunger and exhaustion and a war that was clearly going badly. He chose to believe Wood. 93 men chose to believe Wood. They walked out into the Dutch snow and surrendered to a single American soldier, and in doing so, every one of them made a bet on Wood's honesty and the legitimacy of the promise he had made. That bet, it turned out, was correct. They were processed as prisoners according to the Geneva Convention, transferred to rear areas, and survived the war. Wood died in the Ardennes 6 weeks later. There is an uncomfortable irony in that sequence. The 93 men whose lives his courage preserved in November went on to live. The man who preserved them did not. This is the particular kind of math that war produces, and history has never found a satisfying way to account for it. After the war, Wood's family received his Distinguished Service Cross. His father continued for years to collect accounts of his son's final weeks in the forest, building a record that established as clearly as the fragmentary evidence allowed what had happened after the 106th collapsed. The story of the Snowfield was part of that record, though it received less attention than the dramatic narrative of the Ardennes guerrilla campaign. In Bradford, Pennsylvania, there are memorials to Wood. Veterans of the 82nd Airborne who were present that day in the Netherlands mentioned the incident in their memoirs and in interviews given to historians. The story never quite found its way into the mainstream narrative of World War II, which tends to be told in terms of large operations, famous commanders, decisive battles, turning points that can be marked on a map with a clear date and a clean outcome. What happened in that snowfield near Mook is harder to mark on any map. There is no before and after, no territory gained, no position seized. 93 men who were going to be killed or captured eventually anyway came out earlier than they otherwise would have. The strategic value is essentially zero. The historical footprint is minimal. And yet, there are 93 men who went home after the war because a 23-year-old walked across a field and told the truth to their commanding officer. Some of them had children. Their children had children. Whatever those families became, they became it because of an afternoon in the Netherlands in November 1944, when one person decided that talking was worth trying before anything else. The 82nd Airborne held its positions through the winter. The front stabilized, shifted, stabilized again. In December, the bulge tore through the Ardennes and consumed Wood and thousands of others. In the spring of 1945, the Allied armies crossed the Rhine at last, and the war in Europe moved toward its conclusion. Germany surrendered in May. The Netherlands was liberated. The men who had spent that winter in frozen holes in Dutch soil came home, or most of them did, and tried to reassemble the ordinary lives that the war had interrupted. History sorted itself into the categories it always uses. The large operations got the large chapters. The individual acts of valor got the medals, and the regimental histories and the passages in veterans' memoirs that their grandchildren might or might not read someday. The strange and unclassifiable acts tended to fall through the gaps. Eric Wood, Jr. fell through several gaps at once. He was an artillery officer whose most remarkable combat act involved no artillery. He was an 82nd Airborne soldier who died in the Ardennes with a different division. He was a decorated hero whose decoration described the forest guerrilla campaign rather than the Snowfield negotiation. He was a young man whose story was told most completely by his father, which means it carries the particular warmth and the particular bias that paternal grief always brings to the documentary record. What remains after 8 decades is the core of it: the field, the cold, the single figure walking across white ground, the conversation in German, the 93 men coming out with their hands up. In all of World War II's 8,000 days of fighting across 6 continents, in all the millions of acts of courage and cruelty and endurance and despair that the war produced, that afternoon near Mook stands as one of the more quietly extraordinary things that happened. Not because of its strategic significance, which was negligible, not because of its immediate tactical value, which was real but limited, but because of what it demonstrates about what one person can do when they decide that the situation can be changed and that they are the person to change it. The men who watched from the American side of the field that day watched something they had not seen before and would not see again. Most of them lived long enough to tell the story to someone, which is how it survived at all. Wood did not. He was 23 years old when he died in the Ardennes forest in late December or early January, the exact date unrecorded because no one was there to record it. He was found when the snow melted and the forest gave back its dead, with German soldiers around him and his boots still on his feet. He had walked into that field in the Netherlands because he believed with a certainty that required no external validation that the truth told clearly to exhausted men was more powerful than any weapon he carried. He had been right. And then he had walked into the Ardennes forest with that same certainty, and the forest had been a different kind of problem, one that clarity and courage and excellent German could not solve. That is the story. A young man, a frozen field, 93 men who went home because of a conversation, and a winter that killed the man who started it. Some stories do not resolve into lessons. They simply remain what they are: true, particular, irreducible. This is one of those.